Welcome to the Performance Around the Clock podcast. I am Professor Satchin Panda, a scientist in the field of circadian rhythm. In this podcast, I will talk to experts in many different fields about science, health, and human performance. You'll also find out why circadian rhythms is my favorite topic. I hope you enjoy the podcast and thank you for listening. Welcome to another episode of Performance Around the Clock. I'm super excited to have Professor Steve Austad as my guest. Steve has a long career in aging research, and in fact, I would consider him as the leading voice in aging research because of his rich research and also observation into aging in multiple species. Steve is the distinguished professor in University of Alabama, Birmingham, and he's also the scientific director of the organization called AFAR. And in that organization is actually driving a lot of the aging research in the US. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I have listened to quite a few of your interviews and podcasts. And also, I'm impressed. I guess you are the only one researcher, aging researcher, who has published the same number of scientific publications and newspaper columns, more than 200.
Yeah. I've always liked to write for the general public, so I've continued to do it even after becoming a scientist.
Yes, but you also had some training in writing.
Yes, my undergraduate degree is in English literature, so I read a lot of good writing. Originally, I wanted to be a novelist.
Yeah.
I discovered I had no talent whatsoever for writing novels, so I was looking around for something else I could do. But the training of doing a lot of reading of very good writers somehow, by osmosis, allowed me to develop some skills for communicating.
Yeah, that's very important because in these days, means myself as a scientist, I sometimes struggle how to communicate science to the larger public because the public is the honest taxpayers are funding our research.
You're absolutely right. We owe it to them.
Yes.
To let them know what we're doing. And one of the things that we don't get trained in is communication, and we're just assumed to be able to pick it up, right?
Yeah, it doesn't happen that easily, that naturally.
No.
So there are many podcasts where people have actually asked you about your childhood until your PhD, and I guess I must. I'll encourage all the listeners and viewers to at least listen to IHMC podcast and also I think Peter Attia's podcast where Steve talked about his childhood. And actually, while listening to your childhood story, I realized that you beat me in number of schools I attended before finishing high school because I attended 11, but you beat me at least by 2 times, right?
Yeah. In fact, somebody called me up a few years back saying, "Are you the same Steve Austad that went to Llewellyn Junior High School?" And I said, "I have no idea. Can you give me an idea of where this is in the country?"
But you actually did your PhD so that's when you started your interest in animal science or longevity.
Right. It was actually after my PhD that I got interested in longevity. My PhD was on analyzing, from an evolutionary perspective, animal combat. Because
Animal combat.
Yeah, well, I had this experience training lions, and a lot of what I did was introduce strange lions to one another, where they often fought. And so part of my job was trying to break them apart. But I got very much interested in why animals will fight, why they will just basically put on a display like they're going to fight. And so my whole PhD was really trying to understand the game theory concepts behind why animals fight, why they only display sometimes, and when they fight, sometimes they fight very little, and sometimes they fight to the death. So what explained these various things?
So what kind of animals were you studying?
I was studying spiders at the time, only because they were good for measuring the evolutionary consequences of fights. So one of the things that you needed to do is you needed to measure the reproductive consequences of winning or losing a fight. And it turns out that male spiders don't build webs, they don't eat, they don't do anything except they look for females. That's all they do. So by figuring out how many eggs different females had, I could actually calculate what the evolutionary consequences was of an individual fight, what a male was risking if it fought to the death. So, I mean, I originally went to graduate school planning to study lions in the wild because I'd studied lions in captivity a lot. That didn't work out because that's complicated to get into those studies. So I fell back on this.
Coming back to spider fights,
Yeah.
are most fights between males or between male and female?
Most fights are between males. Now, females occasionally will eat males, but that's really an act of predation. There's no aggression in it. It's just that males are very vulnerable to, because of the position, the mating position is they're right there in the female's fangs. So if she's hungry and she's already been inseminated, there's no point for her not to try to eat the male. Now, the males will try to get away sometimes. Interestingly, I did a postdoc on another species of spiders in which the males had to present a gift, a wrapped insect, in order to mate. And as long as the female was eating the gift, the males could mate without danger. But if she finished it too fast, then she was likely to eat the male. So that was a pretty interesting spider to touch. The spiders would even deceive her. Occasionally, they wouldn't really catch an insect. They'd just get a little piece of dirt or something, but they'd wrap it in so much silk that she couldn't tell the difference. And the females were actually quite happy eating the silk because it's high protein. It was a pretty good meal, but it cost the male a lot then because it was giving out a lot of its silk. So all this is a very long way from longevity. But when I was a postdoc, I went to study some birds in South America. And those birds lived in social groups, a breeding pair, and then several generations of offspring. And I was interested in why the offspring stayed around to help raise their siblings rather than to go find their own mate. But in the course of doing that, it was at a biological field station, and a friend of mine and I got the idea to do a project on opossums. And these are opossums that are very similar to the ones we have in the States. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart unless you were a serious expert. In the course of this project, which had nothing to do with aging or longevity, I discovered that the opossums didn't live any longer than laboratory mice. They lived like 18 months or 2 years at the most. And that was such a surprising discovery to me that it got me interested in longevity. Why would a possum live only a couple of years, but a cat that's about the same size can live 15 or 20 years? And that, from that point on, I mean, the paper I was working on with the opossums eventually was published in Nature, but by the time it was published, I totally lost interest in that, and I was off into aging research. So,
yeah, so going back to this, actually your recent book, The Methuselah's Jew, is a wonderful read because it goes through why different species, different animals live longer or shorter. So let's wrap all of this. You made a statement that the opossum lived as long as the house mouse, but based on the size, you expected this to live for 10 years or more.
right.
So coming back to that question, how, and you published this called longevity quotient.
Yeah.
Can you describe what is?
Yeah, so the longevity quotient is just a quick and easy way to try to understand how long animals live relative to other animals that are the same size. And so it's just a ratio of how long you live compared to how long you would be expected to live if you're an average mammal of that size. And so opossums, because they're so short-lived for the size, have a longevity, now an average mammal by this has a longevity quotient of 1. And if you live longer than average, you have a longevity quotient of greater than 1. If you live twice as long as a standard mammal, you have a longevity quotient of 2. If you live half as long, you have a longevity quotient of about 0.5. So opossums have a longevity quotient of around 0.3 to 0.5, so very, very short-lived. Humans, on the other hand, we're pretty long-lived. If you take another species that's about the same size as we are, like mountain lions are about the same size, they live only into their 20s at the most. So,
even in the zoo?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I see.
But humans can live 80 years easily and up to 100 years occasionally, 120 years very, very occasionally. We have a longevity quotient of about 4.5. So we live about 4.5 times as an average mammal that was the same size as we are.
Yeah, so coming back to your book, you start with birds.
Yeah.
And you also want to do your, during your PhD or postdoc, you worked on birds. Do birds live longer than their size?
They do. Birds are possibly the most successfully aging animals in the world by this criterion. An average bird lives 3 times as long as an average mammal. And that's even comparing birds in the wild versus mammals in zoos or in homes or in laboratories. So the thing that makes that such a spectacular success is not just that they live 3 times that long, but they do it with all of the challenges that living in nature entails. Challenges of weather, challenges of diseases, challenges of predation. And they do this despite having this really high metabolic rate. They have a metabolic rate that's about twice as high as mammals of the same size. Their body temperature is higher. Body temperature can be as high as 109 degrees, their normal body temperature Fahrenheit. And they have these high levels of blood glucose. So if they were a mammal, they would be diabetic. From everything we know about aging, those 3 things together should indicate they'd be short-lived, but they're not. They're long-lived. So how do they do it? This is, I think, one of the major unanswered questions in the field, because it could teach us a lot about dealing with high blood glucose, for instance. It could teach us a lot about many other things, how to avoid damage from our normal metabolism. And I've been surprised to discover that there's virtually no aging research going on in birds right now.
But in birds, is it the flying birds or the birds like chicken and turkey?
That's a good question. There's a good relationship between how much the birds fly and how long they live. So birds like turkeys and pheasants and chickens are short-lived among birds. It's the ones that spend a lot of their life flying around. And we think it's because they basically have created a safe environment for themselves. When they're flying, ground-based predators can't get them. If they're in a bad ecological situation, it's a bad food year, well, they can fly 100 kilometers with no problem. A ground-based mammal would take days to do that. They can fly 100 kilometers in a day and be somewhere else. So they have a lot of ways of avoiding normal dangers that mammals are prey to. Interesting, among the birds, the longest lived ones are the seabirds that breed on islands. And because they're on an island, they're protected from all kinds of things. And you can tell that that's important because a lot of these birds, they have their nests on the island, but they never approach their nests in the daytime. Only at night will they go approach their nests, so that any predator that might be watching them, any bird predator, which would be the main thing, really can't find their nests so easily.
So one thing you pointed out that birds can migrate to a different place if the food is scarce. And actually many of the long-living birds are also migratory birds.
Yeah, and this actually also shows their physiological capabilities, because they can fly 7 days without ever landing. They can fly constantly, day and night, 7 days. Some birds can, the longest migrators. And that's just astonishing, beating their wings, several times per second, day and night for a week. and surviving that.
Yeah.
You know, the longest nonstop bird migration is about the same as the longest commercial airline flight in the world, which I find to be astonishing.
So to do that kind of long distance flying, they're essentially endurance flyer.
Yeah.
So they're mostly oxidative and mostly using their mitochondria. Because I remember once I have some interest in migratory birds.
Wow.
And there was a lab in India. I used to collaborate with Professor Binod Kumar. Now he is retired, and he was one of very few labs, maybe 2 or 3 labs in India who had the license to capture a few migratory black-headed buntings.
Oh.
These buntings would fly from northern Europe to India.
Wow.
And what was interesting was this is one of very few migratory birds that would actually survive in captivity. So that means he had a lab where he had 20 or 30 these birds, and these birds they become so they're day active. But in springtime, as the day length increases in northern Europe, they would eat a little bit at night time, and they would become active 24/7. They gain a lot of weight, and then they fly. And Binod's curiosity was, well, if I capture the bird and then change the day length, will they do the same? And they actually did the same. So they don't eat too much at night. They would eat a little bit, but then they would double their size.
Yeah.
And then after 2 or 3 weeks, just the amount of time it would have taken the birds to fly, they would again become day active and lose all that weight. And so it happens every year. So
yeah, that's storing up the energy for the long flight, right? I mean, hummingbirds do the same thing. There are hummingbirds in the eastern U.S. that migrate nonstop across the Caribbean. You know, and hummingbirds are only a few grams. And so, but before they take off on this long journey, they can double their body weight, you know, in very short order, and put in all this fat that they can use to use the energy for during migration.
So have we learned anything from how the birds repair or maintain their mitochondria? Because they need to keep the mitochondria extremely healthy.
Yeah, no, we haven't. And to me, this is low-hanging fruit. This is a project that's just waiting for somebody to do it, because you're exactly right. They have to have very healthy mitochondria. They have to have a lot of them. They can't afford to have their cells filled up with dysfunctional mitochondria. Do they do it by better repair, better turnover of the mitochondria? It's a complete mystery. And the trouble is, the little research that's gone on in birds has gone on in things like chickens and turkeys that are not the ones that are going to teach us anything.
Because they're the low-hanging.
That's right. That's right. They're the ones you can get. And Japanese quail. But this is a project I would love to see, a large project on this.
But why do birds die, at least in captivity?
In captivity, they die of a lot of different things, a lot of cancer. They get cataracts in captivity eventually. I mean, I have a parrot that we think is 77 years old now. And I say we think it's 77 years old because we've had it for about 40 years. But the people that had it before us claimed that it was 35 when we got it. Now, if that's true, then it really is 77. It's one of the longest living captive parrots in the world. But as I point out in the book, a lot of these tales about exceptional longevity in animals are folk tales. They're not real. And so we don't know if the people were telling us the thing when they gave us this parrot or not. But it doesn't have cataracts. It doesn't show any signs of dementia. We can't tell much about its mobility because we keep it in a cage, right? But the fact that you could have this thing that weighs less than a house cat, that's in its 70s now, is just, again, it's one of these striking observations that, I think my background as a field zoologist makes me sensitive to these things, because I know how hard it is for life to continue under all the challenges of field life. For instance, a laboratory a mouse lives 2 or 3 years in the laboratory. It only lives 3 or 4 months on average in the wild. and the cold gets them, predators get them, there all kinds of things get them. But yet the same size sparrow can live 20 years in the wild. So
Yeah. So then, how did flying begin? Like,
well, that's a very good question, because it clearly had to start as gliding. I think there's no question about that, that animals climb in trees and try to jump to another tree. And if they had a little bit of help, they had, let's say, webs in their fingers or something, then they could glide a little bit farther. And so I think there were lots of advantages to doing that. And there are almost 100 species now of different kinds of animals that can glide. In other words, not have flapping flight, but have gliding flight. The next stage was changing so that the muscles became adapted for flapping up and down. How that happened, we don't know, but we know it's very difficult because it only happened 4 times in the history of life.
4 times.
4 times. So insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Those are the only 4 groups of animals that have evolved flapping flight. And considering that we've had, over 3 billion years to do it, it's quite remarkable. So we have tons and tons of animals that glide, but only a handful have developed the ability to flap and fly.
Flap. Oh. So when it comes to, you said dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They began to fly. So aren't the birds some form of dinosaurs?
Yeah, well, it was a different group of reptiles that I was talking about, not the dinosaurs. Birds are, yeah, you're right. Birds are dinosaurs. So that would be one evolution. But there's a sister group to the dinosaurs called the pterosaurs that started to fly. And they really dominated the skies for over 100 million years. We know of more than 100 species of pterosaurs. But they went extinct with the rest of the large dinosaurs. And some of them were as big as giraffes, by the way. So some of the pterosaurs was as big as giraffes, and they could fly. That's remarkable. We don't think they could probably take off from the ground, but we thought they could leap off of cliffs or something. But they all went extinct when this big asteroid hit the Earth 66 million years ago. And in fact, most birds went extinct at the same time, but a handful survived, and all of our modern birds, or non-terrestrial dinosaurs, you might call them. They then did very well. Suddenly the ecological habitats were opened up because so many things had died. So now we have, twice as many species of birds as we have species of mammals.
Yeah, and then coming back to bats. Bats are mammals, they're not birds. So this is, they're very outlier among the mammals.
Right. And they evolved flight very much more recently than the birds did, so only about 50 million years ago. But they've done very well. They're the second largest group of mammals if you count by the number of species. So after rodents, bats are the next most common group of mammals. And we don't appreciate this so much living in temperate areas. But if you go to the tropics, bats are everywhere. I mean, when I used to work in Venezuela, one of the fun things that I did was sometimes on the weekends we'd drive to the closest little town and we'd go to the movies. And when the light came on in the movies, there were bats inside the theater. So they would fly up to the light of the projector, and then their shadows would be all over the screen. So we'd watch the bats chasing insects on the screen. It was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, actually, that also reminds me, I grew up in a place very close to a national forest in India. And right outside our house, there were 2 or 3 very large mango trees. And on top of those trees, there must be at least 1,000 bats. Every morning they would come back.
Oh, fruit bats, so big bats.
Yeah, big.
Yeah.
Those are
Yeah, those are very neat animals. Yeah.
And then when they take off in the late afternoon, early evening, it's almost like a cloud going over.
Yeah, so I used to work in Papua New Guinea, and one of the main airports there was right near a bunch of these big bat colonies, and they had to change the timing of the flights taking on and off, because if you took off at the wrong time, the air is filled with bats, and they'd fly into the propellers of the plane. And yeah, yeah.
But it was also interesting when I watched the bats, because bats are nocturnal.
Yeah.
And they would come back exactly at the same time around dawn and leave around dusk. And it was kind of interesting to observe that. And that also brings up another question, like bats, there are two types of bats. Some hibernate and some don't hibernate.
Right.
And do the hibernating bats live longer than the non-hibernating?
For the insect-eating bats, so bats eat a great variety of things. Some of them eat fruit, like the mangoes that you did, the fruit bats. They look very much more like your normal mammal. Their face looks like, a dog face or a fox or something. But among the insect-eating bats, yes, hibernation seems to extend life. It almost seems like the time that they spend asleep in the winter, it's almost like a timeout in their life history, right? And one of the ways you can tell that is some species of bats have a very broad latitudinal range. They go from the southern United States, let's say, to northern Canada. The longest live ones are the ones that hibernate the longest, and so that suggests that it's hibernation that's the key. But that brings up another really interesting thing about them with respect to what we can learn from them about aging, which is they can hibernate for 9 months and they wake up and they fly away. You can just imagine staying in your bed for 9 months, right? And then trying to just get up and walk, walk to the other room. So they have some way to restrain their muscles from completely deteriorating and their lung capacity from completely deteriorating, and also not having a great deal of tissue damage from the blast of oxygen that they get after they first wake up. There are other hibernating animals that do this to a lesser extent. My wife is a veterinarian, and she used to teach at Washington State University. Someone there was looking at the cardiac effects of grizzly bears. And so they had grizzly bears there, and in the winter they would hibernate. And one time I was being shown the grizzly bears when they were hibernating in the winter, and as we were sitting there talking about them, one of them got up and we all froze. I thought, oh, this is it. And it walked across the cage and then flopped down. And we're like, I'm not sure that it ever really was awake. It just was using its muscles, I guess. But, I don't think I took a breath the whole time that happened.
No, actually, I've seen a actogram activity recording of hibernating bears. And you'll see once in a while there's this spike. So that means they're getting up. And it's not just restless leg movement or something like that. They get up and then somehow they flop. It's almost sleepwalking, maybe.
Yeah. And bats do something similar, right? They will just flap their wings a few times. They're not perfectly motionless month after month after month.
Yeah, even during daytime, as I was telling you, since these are fruit bats, they're not hiding in the caves. So
That's right.
You can actually watch them during daytime, and they would just spread one wing.
Yeah.
The sun is bothering them.
Yeah. And they murmur, right? There's always this little murmur going on. Like, give me some more room.
So that also brings up another, I work on circadian rhythm, sleep, and circadian rhythm is very close to my heart. And people always say that sleep disruption can kill you. And in fact, many mammals, at least humans, cannot stay awake for several days. Whereas we have migratory birds that are staying awake for 7 to 10 days without losing a bit. Their endurance doesn't go down when they reach the new. That's one extreme. And then the other extreme, again, is bats and hibernating animals who actually go into very long sleep. And even in humans, Now, of course, it's just epidemiological data showing that people who sleep too much, they also don't have long lifespan. So
there's this golden period of sleep that
for humans.
Yeah, and for humans, it's interesting because how many people do that? I mean, I think it's a common problem among academics to not sleep well. I don't sleep well. And I hadn't thought of the birds, but what we know about some birds, so there are birds that can fly for 9 months and never stop, like some swifts. They seem to be able to put half of their brain to sleep at a time, and I'm wondering whether the migratory birds that do this have some capability of that as well. Because you're right, staying awake for 10 days.
I know dolphins also do this hemispheric sleep.
Oh, they do?
Yeah, but at the same time, some part of their brain has to be awake or should be able to wake up very quickly because
Right.
at least for dolphins, they have to do echolocation. Even
Right.
bats also do echolocation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And this is something that, again, it's amenable to observation and experimentation and all.
Yeah.
And it's another aspect of bird biology that I just think should be investigated
Yeah.
more. It's like we investigate it, we go, okay, they have this hemispheric sleep. Well, what does that really mean? What are the mechanisms and how does it rejuvenate? And do the hemispheres have to alternate? And what about things that there aren't two of? What about the hippocampus and things that, you know,
And how is the memory stored on one half of the brain?
Yeah, exactly.
Transferred to the other half because the bird has to remember.
Right, and is it only seen with one eye at that point?
Yeah. Maybe. We don't even know whether it's seeing in one eye or stereoscope.
And they tend to fly into a lot of buildings at night. Maybe that's because of the depth perception is bad.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that we know so little about one kingdom of life almost.
Yeah, I agree. With 10,000 species, and something that people have been interested in for centuries, right? For centuries, people have been looking at birds, and we've put rings on the legs of millions of birds. So a lot of people are interested in them, but yet they're sort of fundamental biology we still don't know a lot of.
Yeah, so I saw in your book, I was surprised that in North America alone, there are nearly 64 million birds ringed and tracked.
Yeah. I used to do this a lot when I was working in Venezuela. We might ring 50 to 100 birds a day. I was only interested in a few, but if you're catching them, you figure, well, we're getting information. And then in North America, there are these banding stations all over the place where seasonally, when birds are migrating, they will be out there catching thousands and thousands and thousands of birds and putting them on. And and one of the stories that I tell in the book is when I got this bird that was migrating through Venezuela, and turned out it had been ringed in Massachusetts that I found out because it had a number on the ring. So I caught it and I sent the number off and I got it back. And this is one of these golden plovers that migrates from Canada to southern tip of South America. And I went out the next year and caught a few birds that were migrating through. I caught the same bird a second time.
What is the chance of you catching the same bird?
Virtually zero, I would have expected, right? But there you go.
So can you tell for the listeners, because many listeners, they don't know what is ringing a bird means?
Sure. So people want to have a way to identify individual birds. So beginning in the early part of the 20th century, people invented these small rings that they could put around the leg of a bird, and it would have a number on it. Or if you're really interested in identifying individuals from a distance, you'll put different colored rings on. So if you look at the bird through your your binoculars, you'll be able to say, oh, that's got a red and a blue and a yellow band on its left leg, and then you'll know what it is. And so that's a different kind of banding. But just for tracking population trends, there's a whole subculture that's what they do. They band birds. They go out and you can get a banding permit, and you can buy bands, and you just have to record it and send them into the bird banding laboratory. And so they have records on millions and millions and millions of birds. It's, in fact, the longest lived bird that we know, which is this Elysian albatross named Wisdom, was ringed by somebody from the National Banding Lab on Midway Island in 1956.
1950s.
And was at least 5 years old then, and this bird is still alive now, still living in the wild.
What is this bird? What species?
It's an albatross.
Albatross? Okay.
And it's a Elysian albatross. And ironically, the person that ringed it is an ornithologist named, obviously, Robbins is his name. He ringed it. He was 38 years old, and he died a few years ago at 98 years old, and the bird is still alive. It's remarkable.
So now with the modern technology, are these rings carrying any GPS device?
That's different. They do have them that do that, so you can, you can track individual birds. They're small enough to do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're learning a lot more about bird migration just from those things. But I mean, most people don't realize how massive it is, because most birds migrate at night, and they migrate, high. So most people aren't aware of them, but same thing with bats, is that bats migrate lower. Bats are, people are worried about wind turbine energy killing birds. Bats are at much more danger from these things than birds are, because birds tend to fly higher than these things. But yeah, the migration that we don't realize is going on above us is just remarkable. And it's one of the things that with habitat destruction, I mean, we're losing a lot of these migratory birds. So it's kind of sad. I know when I lived in Texas is sort of famous for the number of bats that it has. At certain times of the year, you can see the bats on weather radar. They show up on weather radar because millions of them will pour out of caves at the same time. And so you can actually see them. Oh yeah, well, the storm coming in, but what you're seeing there, that's the bats leaving the cave.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
They're so odd. But you mentioned that most of these migratory birds, bats, they fly at night. And even during daytime, it's really, means they don't have Google Maps and Apple Maps. So then what was interesting, a few years ago, someone in circadian rhythm field came up with the idea that the circadian clock gene cryptochrome is a magnetoreceptor, at least for some species. Mm-hmm. It senses the magnetic field of the Earth, and then that's how it can help birds migrate from one place to another.
It sounds very plausible to me. I mean, the remarkable thing to me is that birds might migrate 7,000 miles in one direction, migrate back the other direction, and nest in the same place that they left the year before, even the same nest.
Yeah, so that also shows a remarkable memory. Because even some birds, like I live on top of a canyon, there are these California blue jays, mm-hmm. and because I realized that the blue jay comes and loves peanuts.
Yes.
And it doesn't eat it. It just picks it up, flies to the canyon, and then comes back for another peanut. And then I looked up, realized that this blue jay can hide up to 1,400 nuts in specific areas and will remember where the nuts are hidden and will go back to the earliest hidden nuts to consume them. It's remarkable how even beyond flying, how is the remarkable memory, spatial memory. And even hummingbirds, they will remember which flower they had visited, so they don't waste their energy going back to the same flower. Yeah,
and that kind of spatial memory is something that people tend to lose late in life, right? But birds, if they lose it, then they're dead.
Yeah.
So they have and the same thing with bats. So bats fly, insect-eating bats might fly 50 miles in a night. They not only find their way back to the cave, but there might be 1 million bats in the cave, and they might have left a pup somewhere in that cave. They have to be able to find that pup again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just remarkable that they can find their way back to the cave, much less to their pup out of 1 million others that are in there.
Yeah, so we talked about flying. What about animals that live underground? Do they live longer?
Yes. Well, they do. Yes, they do if under certain conditions. They have to really be underground animals. That means they have to stay there. They can't be like moles. They come up to the surface quite a bit. But the animals that stay underground, they tend to live a very long time. Not only in the wild, but even longer when we bring them into the laboratory. The sort of classic example of this is the naked mole rat, which lives underground in these large colonies, very seldom exposes itself to danger, and they live pretty close to the equator, so the temperature is pretty much constant underground. So they live in a very constant, safe environment. And they're the same size as a mouse, but they live 10 times longer than a mouse in captivity. But there's a number of relatives of the naked mole rat that don't live in big colonies. They're also long-lived. They're not as long-lived. And even other things that are called mole rats, even though they're not close relatives, there's a thing called a blind mole rat. They also live a long time. And again, they live their entire life underground. So there's something about living underground. Maybe it's the safety and the constancy of the environment. I think there might be more to it, though. I think it might have something to do with the atmosphere that they live in underground. Because, if you live in a small enclosed space and you breathe a lot, you're going to drive down the oxygen and drive up the carbon dioxide. This actually is a problem for bats as well, because if there's a million bats in a cave and it's not well ventilated, people that study bats in cave actually have to be careful about the atmosphere when they go in. They typically, they wear respirators because they might go into this area that has this tremendous concentration of ammonia in there, and it could be fatal. So all these underground animals have a great capacity to live in low oxygen and high carbon dioxide, and it's hard for me to think that low ability to live in low oxygen might not have something to do with it, because it seems to be this trend that all animals that live underground in poorly ventilated areas deal with.
So that means these underground animals, since they're not flying, they don't have to flap or do much with their mitochondria. They may not have too much oxidative respiration.
That's right. That's right. Although they do fight, but they don't chronically. They don't do so much. And the workers. This is an interesting part. So, in other things that have social organization, like the naked mole rats, like honeybees and ants and all, where there's a queen and a whole bunch of workers, the queen tends to live a long time, and the workers live a short time. And that's true as well of the naked mole rats in nature. But when you bring them into the laboratory where the workers are not having to do all of that work, it's not true. They all live a long time. But in the field, the workers only live 2 or 3 years. And it may be that all the foraging and the new tunnel building and all that, they actually do have a fair amount of oxidative metabolism. And that may be why they only live a couple of years in the field.
So this is interesting. In one case, in birds, the oxidative metabolism may be giving them the power to fly and live longer, whereas here, too much work for honeybees to all these social structured animals. Actually, we don't know whether it's the cause, it's just correlation.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's one of the reasons that I think that there's a major unlearned lesson in the birds. We know that living slowly as a species, reptiles live longer than mammals because they have a very, very low metabolic rate, relatively speaking. That's why we would expect birds, because they have such a high metabolic rate, we expect them to be short-lived, but somehow they've overcome that physiological barrier, and we really don't have a clue as to how they do it. And their mitochondria are not that much different than ours. This should be a problem that is soluble.
Yeah. So now we talked about naked mole rat that are under the ground, and we are coming up to the reptiles. Do reptiles live longer than the mass? Or?
Yeah, but reptiles well, yes, they live longer than mammals. So the longest living reptile that we know is something called a sphenodon or a tuatara, that are, that are a half meter long, a couple of feet long. And they routinely live 100 years. And some of them may live 150 years or more. Now, when I first read about this, I was highly skeptical because, like I say, there are all these folk tales that turn out to be bogus. But I did quite a bit of research, including contacting someone that there was a newspaper article about who said that this 119-year-old male had just fathered a new litter of new sphenodons. And I thought, 119, it sounds bogus, it's too exact. So I called him up and I said, how do you know how old it is? And this man is, and these only live on islands off the coast of New Zealand. This man was the guru of sphenodons. He knew how to keep them in captivity. He kept some in captivity for over 50 years. And he knew how fast they grew, so he would measure them. And he extrapolated from the rate at which they grew to the much larger ones that he found in the field, that they had to live at least 100 years. And this one that was 119, supposedly, he knew it was over 100. Somebody made up the 119, that having it be that exact. But it actually had a tumor on its testicles. And they wanted to save it because he's the savior of sphenodons. So a veterinarian came and removed the tumor, and suddenly he felt reproductively active again. And he put him together with a female, and the next thing you knew, they had little babies. So I am quite convinced now that these things are real. Yeah. They have a very low metabolic rate. They have a very slow growth rate, very slow growth rate. So if you can imagine a thing that's just 50 centimeters long, that's over 100 years, you realize how slow they must grow.
Yeah. So do all reptiles, or there are specific reptiles and then there are some outliers?
Right. I mean, there are some reptiles that no doubt are short-lived. There are some that, like the ones that expend a lot of energy to hunt. My guess is that those are shorter lived. But for most of the ones, for snakes, for instance, they live a very long time. But they may just sit in one spot and not move for months at a time. So that's not all that interesting. But things like alligators and crocodiles, they are also pretty long-lived. They live 80 plus years.
But they also don't eat that much.
They don't eat that often either. No. Yeah, that's the thing. They fast for 90 days. Yeah, and this is really quite interesting because I know, because a friend of mine studies pythons and other constricting. They can go months and months and months and not eat anything, and then they catch something, and within days their intestines grow. Their heart grows, everything grows, and then they eat and digest this, and then it all shrinks back down again, and they coil up and they wait for months and months and months for the next prey item. So it's not surprising that they live a long time. We don't really know how long these things live because they live long enough that people haven't followed individuals.
Yeah. But it also goes against what many nutritionists say, that you should not just gorge for a few days and then go on yo-yo diet because that will kill you. But in nature, we see so many examples where the species actually goes through yo-yo diet. And
that's exactly right. Yeah, extreme yo-yo diet, right? I mean, this is why we can learn so much from nature, because almost any pattern that you can imagine, nature has found a way to make that successful. Mm-hmm. And that's really why I think that in aging research, for those of us who work in animals and aging research, we have a bizarre approach if you think about it. We only study mechanisms of aging in these things that are demonstrably unsuccessful, right? like a mouse, a fly, a worm. They live days or weeks, or in the case of a mouse, a few years. The idea is that if we can understand how to make them live instead of 2 weeks, 2 months, that might teach us something about us who already live 80 years to live an extra 30 or 40 years. Yeah. To me, I and I understand the rationale that there are fundamental processes of aging, and they're very similar in different animals, but still remains, we survive those for decades and decades and decades. So to me, it's not surprising that when we find something in a mouse or a rat or a fruit fly, that it so seldom translates into something that's useful to, I mean, some of it does, no question, but a lot of it doesn't. And I think it suggests that there may be an alternative way to go about understanding longevity.
Yeah, so we talked about the air, underground. What about in the water?
Yeah, in the water, this is where the longest lived animals all live. It's in the ocean. Now the ocean, it's most of the earth. It's the overwhelm. If you take the biosphere, the part of the earth that that animals can live in, it's 90+% all of it. 70% is of the earth is covered by the ocean. But if you look at the depth of the ocean, then most of the biosphere, most of the animal life that we have lives in the ocean. And as a consequence, we have some incredibly long-lived animals that live in the ocean. The longest one that we know about, the longest vertebrate that we know about is apparently the Greenland shark, which evidence suggests can live almost 400 years.
400 years.
400 years. And that's not a very precise measure because it's based on carbon dating and all, but it kind of fits with what we know about how fast they grow, how fast they move. This is almost the epitome of an animal that lives a very slow life. So the Greenland shark's top swimming speed seems to be less than the walking speed that most of us have. And you wonder, well, how do they ever catch any prey? And I think they must do it by stealth, because they find in their metabolic rate is so low that if you eat one juvenile seal a year, that takes care of all of their energy demands. So very, very slow moving, very, very slow metabolizing, very, very slow growing. The evidence is that they don't reach sexual maturity until 150 years or so. And to me, that's the most baffling life history I can imagine, because waiting around 150 years and all the accidents that could happen in 150 years that kill you before you ever reproduce, I don't know. Like I say, this is all based on relatively indirect evidence, but to me, whether they only live 300 years or 400 years is still quite remarkable. I don't think the mechanism of it is so remarkable, because I think they've just slowed down all of life's processes to the point almost of stopping. But the fact is, they can live this long, long time. So I don't think that for all of their long life that we're liable to learn a great deal relevant to human aging from these guys.
From these marine animals.
Yeah, but yeah. Well, it depends. See, I think the exact opposite for the long-lived whales. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what. So the longest lived whale that we know lives over 200 years, not 400 years, but over 200 years. And I actually think that this is one of the rare times where we've underestimated the longevity of the whales. I think they might live substantially longer than that. And the reason that I say that is that the way that they've estimated the age of these whales is they've looked at the eyelids, and they've looked at something called amino acid racemization in the eyelids. So, amino acids change from left-handed to right-handed at a certain rate. It depends on the amino acid. It also depends on the temperature. And the first approximation of doing that, they figured out of a selection of 40 of these whales that about 4 of them lived at least 150 years, and 1 of them lived over 200 years. Now, to make that calculation, they assumed that they had a normal mammal body temperature of 37 degrees, right? Now, these, like the Greenland shark are the most polar of all the sharks. They live in the coldest water. The same is true of the bowhead whale. They do not migrate to warm water to reproduce like most of the big whales. They spend their entire life, in the Arctic Ocean. It's hard for me to imagine that their eye, which is just centimeters from freezing cold water their whole life, is experiencing a normal 37-degree mammalian body temperature. And in fact, they did do the deep core body temperature of the bowhead whale sometimes later, and it was 33 degrees, so it was quite a bit colder. But they still haven't done the eye. And the eye lens, again, it's centimeters from freezing cold water. I recalculated the way that they calculated just with the new core temperature that we now knew. And the bowhead whales, that estimate was now that they live 250 years. So I'm thinking if the eye is even colder than that, which I think is quite possible, then they might live as long as the Greenland shark if they don't get killed by hunters.
Yeah, so that means all the whales that are living now, they must have survived all the hunting that went on for almost 250 years.
Right, and that's remarkable because we knocked down the whale populations by over 90%. So right now, most of the whales that people see are relatively young, because the old ones were all killed off, and so there's a very rare one that lives that long. Yeah. But it's something that we can learn from because, unlike things like reptiles or sharks, that the colder the water gets, the slower everything gets. When mammals are cold, their metabolism speeds up, right? So the metabolism of whales that live in cold water is roughly 3 times our metabolism. So they're living a long time, again, despite having a relatively high body temperature and a really high metabolism. They recently calculated that they had been underestimating the amount that whales ate by about 3-fold. Yeah. It's not an easy problem to address, right?
It's not like mice. We go to the hopper and figure out how much they ate.
Yeah. No.
So it's kind of interesting that almost every species that we discussed, there's something that goes against what we know might be driving aging and longevity. But there is also another question that is, in every animal, I would look at every animal life as 3 stages of life. One, development, when they're not reproducing. They're just getting ready to be stronger, to be able to reproduce. And then the second phase is the reproductive phase. And then the third one is post-reproductive. In all the species that we discussed, is the long lifespan because of one of the stages being longer?
Interesting. Well, there is a pretty good relationship between how long it takes to reach reproductive maturity and total lifespan. In nature, relatively few animals have a post-reproductive lifespan. So the question is, does developmental time inform us about total lifespan? And it seems to. So for instance, bats take about 9 months to a year to reach maturity. A mouse the same size takes
7 weeks.
Yeah.
6 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So there does seem to be a relationship. The same with birds. Birds, even the ones that not long after the egg seem like they can fly, they can kind of fly, they don't reach maturity for close to a year. So everything's slowed down early in life and everything, and then the life is longer. So there's a pretty good relationship. But I mean, part of this may have to do, with the speed at which cells have to replicate. Mm-hmm. The faster they replicate, the less time there is to check your DNA and make sure, correct any mistakes and all. And so this makes some kind of sense to me.
I see. But the somatic cell division, even if we take some fibroblasts, say, from bats, from any animal, say, do they divide at the same rate? Because my somehow in the back of my mind, what I think is the circadian clock kind of gates cell cycle. So that means the cell cycle cannot go faster than, say, roughly 18 hours.
Yeah, no, I think,
And
yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something, because if we take bat cells or whale cells and we put them in standard culture, standard temperatures, they seem to replicate at about the same rate.
yeah,
They lose a lot of their uniqueness.
Of course.
For instance, we know, that whales have a low per cell metabolic rate. Well, if we take the cell out of the whale and we put it in culture at 37 degrees, it replicates like anything else. It's one of the I guess one of the barriers to understand, to what we can learn from cells and culture. An interesting thing about the circadian idea is these, the longest lived fishes are the ones that live deep in the ocean, where it's eternal night for them. Do you know, do they have circadian rhythms?
yeah. So they do have circadian rhythm in a different way because their food availability is circadian.
Okay.
So the food availability drives it, and then there's some cave fish who don't have an eye
Right.
to begin with.
Right.
But what is interesting is they have a degenerate eye-like structure, and that eye-like structure expresses this light-sensing protein called melanopsin. And even that tiny amount of light that they get is enough to reset. Even for naked mole rat who are living under the desert sand.
Right.
Actually, I have a collaborator from France. He put light meters into naked mole rat caves.
Oh.
And what he found was the dead roots actually become light tunnel.
Ah, wow.
And then you can get this. So these naked mole rats, although they're living underneath in tunnels, they have a starry sky, so to say, because
That's interesting.
this tiny amount of light actually filters through, and that's what he thinks might be entraining their clock. And in fact, I have a colleague in UCSD, Michael Gorman. He did a very simple experiment. He would put mice in complete darkness and then put the amount of light that would typically come out of a LED indicator in an instrument in the vivarium. And it was less than 1 lux, maybe 0.2 to 0.5 lux of light. And that amount of light was enough to entrain. Wow.
So given this, so I have a question for you now. In the laboratory, we mimic these things by turning the lights off and turning the lights on, but that's not the way that things happen in the real world. Yeah. In the real world, light comes and goes gradually, but also is accompanied by temperature changes.
Yeah.
And we don't do that. And so are we really, by changing the light cycle in our vivarium, are we really replicating the kind of circadian rhythms that animals really experience in nature?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And then the point is, if animals are sleeping at night, those who are awake at night, it's a very different. So for mouse, it's a very different story because they're awake, and then when the sun is coming up, they're slowly seeing that that light ramp. But those who sleep at night, for them, it's not very different because we don't know how lighted the room is until we open our eyelid. And flipping the switch is almost like opening the eyelid. So there is some caveat to that. So coming back to temperature change, I actually did the experiment to see how the reverse way. I wanted to see how much temperature change I personally experience.
Okay.
So I carried a temperature logger that typically goes on containers, in shipping containers, to figure out. So these have very long battery life. I had this sensor that was the size of a small watch in my outside jacket pocket. During daytime, I would have it on me, and then in the evening, I would leave it on my bedside. I did it for a year. And the insight I got was we are living almost like mice in North America, because in North America, my ambient temperature was somewhere between 20 to 22 degrees centigrade, except when I was walking from my car to the institute or back,
Right.
that's when it spiked a little bit. But when I travel to Europe, India, or Asia or Africa, I would experience a very strong 10 degrees centigrade cycle. And what is interesting, I always observed, is in the US, I always have difficulty maintaining my sleep. I wake up once or twice sometimes. But when I travel to all these other countries, people always say that, well, you must be jet lag and all that stuff. But actually, I sleep much better, much consolidated.
Oh, really?
My other question is, my curiosity is, does this temperature cycle help us consolidate our sleep? And so that will be interesting to see in animals. So actually, we are doing an experiment now where we ramp up the temperature. So we do a temperature cycle in mouse cages. And it's an expensive experiment because these are specialized cages. So we do 8-degree temperature cycle because based on my own experience.
That seems reasonable. Yeah.
So we do 10 degrees, so 8-degree temperature cycle, and that completely changes mouse metabolism, its sleeping pattern. And actually, we did it at 3 different ranges, and we are repeating it in 2 different strains of mice because, as you know, almost all laboratory strains of mice, almost all, not all, do not produce melatonin.
Right, right.
So we have another species, another mouse strain from Europe that actually produces melatonin. So we have this experiment going on.
That's very interesting to me because I think this is a problem with the way we keep our laboratory animals. That I think, and there's no reason that we couldn't have the vivarium have an 8-degree temperature. That would be a trivial problem if we did it throughout the vivarium rather than cage by cage like you're doing it.
Yeah, but there is another experiment we did that was with baboons.
Okay.
And that was in Nairobi. There is an institute called Institute of Primate Research. It's this is where actually Richard Leakey trained many primatologists, and Sapolsky kind of toward the tail end of his career he was there. And in this place they do have baboons and green monkeys, and they live in open, like big huge cages, enclosures with 2 or 3 stories, so they can run around and walk around. And that's where we did an experiment where, although these baboons were wild caught, quarantined, and they lived there for 18 months, towards the end, we put them in individual cages inside a room. But this room was getting indirect daylight. So they had windows and they would get the daylight. The temperature was also 10 degrees centigrade cycling temperature, just like outside. And we put a temperature sensor logger between their shoulders, so it's skin temperature, you can say. And that's where we saw the skin temperature was cycling 3 degree, 33 to 37 and back. It was a very strong cycling. And they were also given 2 meals a day, just like in many places. And they would, so they would get a meal at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then at 5 o'clock they would clean up the cages and leave. So we did an experiment we collected 64 different tissues, including many brain regions, and we found very strong circadian rhythm. But what is interesting is from that experiment, I always remember the Wisconsin and NIA longevity study. And what I always find intriguing, that is rarely addressed, is how the feeding schedule was in these 2 facilities. Of course, the Wisconsin diet was a little bit heavy in sucrose.
Right.
People always say that might be one reason. But in NIA, I think in one of the places, I think in NIA, they used to actually clean up the cages at the end of the day. They were given 2 meals. Whereas in Wisconsin, the ad libitum-fed monkeys, they were, I'm not sure whether the cages were clean or they assumed that the monkeys actually ate all their foods. So I've seen this difference, like how even captive monkeys actually can keep very little food and can eat that snack later on. And we always think that that tiny bit of snacking is nothing. It should not do anything to the animal. But actually in mouse, when we do time-restricted feeding, where the mice are fed within X number of hours, the mice that eat normal chow, standard diet, they eat very little during daytime. They eat 12 to 18% of their food, which for most biologists is negligible. But when you consolidate that food to that 8 to 10 hours, then they preserve their muscle mass very late into their old days. So that's how I think these rhythms in temperature, rhythms in feeding, fasting, for at least animals that eat every day, we're talking about snakes and reptiles.
That's quite interesting, because and this is very rare to do this kind of experiment, right? Because there have been things would say, well, what happens when we increase the temperature? We keep them at 30 degrees instead of 22. Well, that has an effect on stuff, but that's not the way they live either, right? The way they live is that temperature goes up and down, light goes up and down, and in training, it's interesting. When I lived in New Guinea, so I lived in a very remote village, and the circadian rhythm of the people there, of course, is close to the equator, so the day length doesn't change that much over the course of a year. But I mean, you could set a watch if you had a watch. It starts to get light, all the fires are suddenly going, and people are eating, and when it gets dark, that's it. Yeah, everything stops. You know, they're done eating, they go to bed, and nothing happens until it gets light again. Yeah. So they get lots of sleep. But they definitely are doing time-restricted feeding, very definitely doing time-restricted feeding. And they tend to eat, and they don't tend to snack either. They tend to eat like 2 sweet potatoes in the morning and 2 sweet potatoes at night. You know?
Yeah, I also spent maybe a week, not that long, in Masai Mara, next to a Masai village. And they also eat only once, like all day. Herding cows, and then in the evening they would come back, drink some milk, and then few tubers, and if they're lucky, maybe somebody might have killed a goat or sheep, and then they would share that. So they're also eating within a very narrow window of time. The food is not, sometimes if you look at the food, you're like, really? That's all you eat?
No, it's true. It's same in New Guinea. People would go out for the day to do something and take 1 sweet potato. That was it, you know.
So coming back to this discussion about the longevity, and then we discussed how if the development is slow, then it has a good correlation with the total lifespan. So that... and then many of the species, like birds, they are actually reproducing until the end of their life, almost until the end. What about mammals like bats? Because bats also have estrous cycle, I assume. And do they reproduce until the end, or do the females actually, female bats hit menopause?
Not regularly. And actually, some bats have more like a menstrual cycle than an estrous cycle. There have been a few reports of bats. Now, this is interesting. If you watch animals in nature, it quite often, they may not reproduce towards the end of their life, but that may be because they were sick, and the other animals that lived longer than they did at those same ages were still reproducing. So I do think a post-reproductive period of life is pretty rare. In nature.
But in zoo, in captive
animals, oh, that's interesting. So captive bats, you know, that is a good question, because usually in zoos, the bats that are kept in zoos are usually not tracked on an individual level. They're usually in these big group cages. I don't know. It's an interesting question, particularly for those like the fruit bats that put a fair amount of care into their offspring. Actually, all the bats. put quite a lot of care, but the care is only by the females. And one of the interesting things about bats is that it tends, in nature at least, males tend to be longer lived than females.
They're different from humans.
Yes, yes. In fact, the longest lived bat that we reported, we had a Russian postdoc who knew the Russian that was watching these, and we convinced this guy, because we heard he has some really long lived bats, to send us all the data. And so the longest lived one lived 41 years, and this is something that weighs 6 grams. But of all the ones that lived 20 years or more, 100% of them were males. And so that's absolutely striking. And whether that has to do with the rigors of reproduction, because female bats have the largest young of any mammal, and then they take care of it for a long time. And for some of them, at least, they carry it initially with them, making the costs of, of getting, and then even after they stop carrying it and they leave it in the roost, they're having to feed for 2. And so it may have to do with the fact that there's just this additional metabolic load that the females have in the field. Now, that wouldn't be necessarily true in captivity, but like I say, they usually don't track individual bats in captivity.
Because when it comes to humans, I don't remember where I saw the graph, maybe in National Academy of Medicine, some conference, showing that as we humans reach the equivalent of menopause is, say 50, 55, after the reproductive hormones go down, that's when our all-cause mortality goes up.
Yeah.
Because until then, it's depression, suicide, accidents, and all this stuff is affecting us. And then after that, and I'm not sure whether there is just a simple correlation or whether the reproductive hormones actually do play a big role. But the reason why I'm bringing this up, when we are thinking about human longevity now, the women now are living more number of years in postmenopausal state than in their reproductive states. And then the question is, are there successful post-reproductive longevity in nature? And if we look at all the species that we discussed, of course, we have to look at mammals. Are there any examples that there is a mammal that actually lives really long after the equivalent of menopause? That would be
yes, there is. There are not a lot, but there are some that are fairly well documented. Killer whale, they're all whales pretty much. Killer whales, pilot whales, but they live a long time, maybe a third of their lives after the end of reproduction. And whether they have the same kind of mortality rate acceleration after they lose those reproductive hormones, we don't know, because we don't have data on enough of those. But it is an interesting question. So in the evolutionary biology world, there is this idea that menopause is somehow an adaptation. And it's an idea that I don't agree with. But the idea is that women stop reproducing at a certain point so that they can use the excess energy to better take care of their existing children or the children of their existing children. And the reason, and it's a very kind of intuitively satisfying idea. The reason that I don't believe it is that if you look at the ovarian follicle dynamics in women, and you look at them in chimpanzees, which typically don't have menopause, they're pretty much identical. The difference is that we live way longer than the chimpanzees. So to me, it seems more like we've lengthened our life, but the ovary hasn't had a chance to catch up with it. And now that people are seriously studying the ovary, and also if it were adaptive, why would there be these negative health consequences of losing those? You expect that there would be a health improvement when you turned off those hormones, and that's not what we see. Now that there are people seriously studying the aging of the ovary, it's quite clear that it's, menopause is not just the turning off of a faucet. It's the end of a long period of aging that the reproductive system is undergoing. And it strikes me as that's the intriguing thing, is why does that system in women age so much more quickly than all the other systems?
Yeah.
I find this really intriguing, and now that there's this huge push in women's reproductive health, and we know that women that have a later menopause live longer, and that women that have an earlier menopause live shorter.
Okay, so can you repeat that? So women who have
late menopause tend to be longer lived, and the reverse. So delaying menopause seems to have health advantages, which isn't surprising if you look at what changes after menopause. So I don't think it's an adaptation. I think it's just a product of our evolutionary history. The other reason is that the power of natural selection to choose beneficial states, it wanes as things get older. And to have this thing happen at the age of 50, that suddenly this brand new adaptation strikes me as unlikely. That's not a popular viewpoint, I understand, but it seems to me to fit with what we're learning now about the ovary, which is that it really is aging faster. It's not that it just turns off, it's that all the cells in the ovary seem to be aging at this remarkably fast rate, so that at 50 years, the ovary basically dies.
Yeah, but there is also thymus that slowly shrinks and almost disappears.
Yeah.
Both male and female, right? There is another, so it'll be interesting to see how that.
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that actually look at the rate of that. That would be fairly easy to look at.
Yeah.
Now, right, with ultrasound or something. That would be very interesting to see what that's timing, or does it happen at a different rate in things that in mice that we know how to make live longer, many ways.
Just if coming back to the very beginning, we talked about LQ.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that humans have a LQ of almost 5.
Yeah.
Humans outliers among all the non-human primates or primates?
Yeah, they are. They're certainly an outlier, with one exception, actually. There is a small monkey, a capuchin monkey, that's the kind of organ grinder monkey. And if you can believe the data, they can live into their 50s. And if you calculate the LQ of them, it's actually a little bit longer than humans. But here's where I say, if you can believe the data, because I tracked down the data on the 55-year-old capuchin, and the longest lived one and the second longest lived one both came from the same woman in Cuba who sold them to an institution in Indiana, and they then moved to an institution in New York, and their longevity is 15% longer than any other reported longevity of that species of monkey, making me think that the birth date was erroneous, which often happens when things move from place to place to place. But if it's true, if they really can live into their 50s, then their LQ is a little bit longer, actually, than humans.
But even if we consider humans as the longest, what makes us live such a long life?
Well, I think that we have created for ourselves an extremely stable, safe environment, and that tends to lead to longer life. And I think we've done that with our sociality, with our ability to manipulate our environment. We've had fire now to help us get food for over 200,000 years. Our diet, the increasing breadth of our diet also helped us. So I think we live this. Now this is fairly recent, right?
Yeah.
If we had been having this discussion in 1500, we would say, they live about twice as long as a normal mammal, and that would put us right there with all the primates.
But some of the Roman emperors, they lived beyond 50s.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
more than 2,000 years ago.
That's right. There were occasional ones.
Yeah.
So life expectancy is not a very good metric of how long the oldest people lived. I mean, one of the Egyptian emperors appeared to live into his 90s.
Yeah.
You know, from how long he served and all. So it's not new, and that really is what's different. Because if you look now at the life histories of the hunter-gatherers that we know quite a bit about now, and you look at the life histories of a more recently studied population of chimpanzees, very deep in the Kibale forest in Uganda. They're the longest lived chimpanzees that anybody's ever found. And they're now finding chimpanzees in their 70s or so. If you look at the life expectancy of that group of chimpanzees and most hunter-gatherers, they're fairly similar. But the difference is there are these humans even there that live into their 80s, maybe even more. None of the chimpanzees are doing that. So we certainly have changed from when we diverged from chimpanzees. But I think what the real change has been in the last couple hundred years, where we didn't all die of, in fact, life expectancy of elephants is longer than life expectancy of hunter-gatherers. Yeah. And that's only because they have very low infant mortality. And elephants have very low infant mortality, whereas hunter-gatherers have high infant mortality, right? Because but elephants, again, they don't live more than about 80 years, and then humans, as you point out, have lived longer than that for as long as we have records.
Yeah. So, so you think that it's what we have done to ourselves?
I do.
Food, and then
sociology.
If we do the same thing to a zoo animal,
over enough generations. Yeah, I mean, it didn't happen suddenly, but yeah, I mean, look, we've selected for longevity many times. It's like anything else, you can select and make it bigger or shorter.
Yeah. So now you have been involved in many organizations that are interested in research into longevity. And can you tell us who are really leading the charge, and what are some of the exciting stuff that you see from 60,000 feet, because you really have your hand on the pulse of longevity research?
Yeah, I think what gets the most attention is new drugs. And there are going to be new drugs coming out right and left. I don't think that any of those are going to have a huge impact in the near future. Although it's hard to say, because so many companies are now starting up to chase this drug or that drug. I do think the most promising things for having a modest effect, like I'm not one of these people that think we're going to live 300, 400, 500 years anytime soon. What strikes me as entirely plausible is 100-year human life expectancy. And that's because, at least the laboratory animals, we've been able to extend life by 20% in many ways, from intermittent fasting to drugs to whatever. I think that probably the most interesting thing to me is the combination of things that we might be able to do, because we don't do this in laboratory animals. We never exercise them at the same time we're doing this or that and the other. The intermittent feeding, I think, is something that really is going to catch on. I'd be surprising how fast it's caught on in human literature. It's one of my colleagues says there's over 100 studies now. I go, really, already? Really? Yeah.
I remember the first time. It was really difficult to publish that paper.
Is that right?
It got bounced in many different journals, and then after it was published, people would ask me, well, there was something fishy about that.
Yeah, really.
How can these mice eat the same number of calories? You must have missed measuring something. And it was so disheartening that I actually stopped going to conferences for a year.
Oh, really? Because nobody would believe the results.
Nobody would believe it.
Yeah.
And then after 2 or 3 years, things began to change after we and even my my NIH application should not be discussed because the significance was 7, 8, or 9. I would get significance score. They would say humans eat 3 meals a day within 10 to 12 hours. So it has no significance. So then we actually did the study in humans to see when people eat. We found that most people eat beyond 12 hours.
Yeah.
But it also surprised me because in those early days, I also knew that a lot of research findings in rodents don't translate to humans. And in some of the popular talks, people would ask me, should we do? And then I say, well, if you have a C57B6 mouse, because we haven't done it in other mouse strains, and we have seen in calorie restriction studies how it's different. So I have to be very conservative. I have to say that do it in mice. And I am surprised how it has caught on. But going back to my question, I think, just like you said, we are living at a LQ of 5 because of multiple things. And over the last 100 years, if we just think about the germ theory of disease, which led to vaccination, antibiotics, and sanitation. And if we use similar stuff now in longevity research, that maybe something is breaking down, whether it's immunity, mitochondria function, or something out of those 12 hallmarks, then it will not be a one drug because not a single vaccine, not a single antibiotics actually can be ascribed to for our long lifespan. It's a combination of many things. So I guess that's what I feel, that yes, individual drugs are important. And even if we go back to the long successful history of cancer, or at least some kind of cancers, like breast cancer is not a death sentence anymore for many people.
Hodgkin's disease. Yeah.
There are so many but there is no single cancer pill that cures all cancer. Which of course it started, if you go back to very early days, then it was chemos. They were giving the same chemo for all cancer, but at least it got refined. So I guess that might happen.
Yeah, I think the other thing is combining that with other lifestyle, with exercise, combining that with maybe blood transfusions. That's very interesting work to me. You put all these things together, then having a substantial increase in human longevity, maybe 100-year life expectancy, strikes me as plausible, as long as we don't abandon science, which is something I'm kind of worried about right now.
But I guess this is where, again, philanthropic support becomes very important. Because if you look at even in the US science, there are many philanthropists who have made a huge impact. HHMI is a great example.
The Gates Foundation. I mean, I think that may be where the breakthroughs are going to come from. It might be, because I think that private philanthropy also has a higher tolerance for risk, for risky. I mean, those of us who live on NIH money realize that what you're likely to get funded is incremental science. A friend of mine just won a Nobel Prize. And I remember back a few years when he told me he just submitted the best grant of his life and it didn't get discussed. And I think, okay, now you've got a Nobel Prize. Now tell people that story.
No, I guess this is very important also, because if we look at now US economy and some of the big companies, if we just take the top 5 companies in terms of revenue, the top 5 account for almost close to $10 trillion. And out of those 10 trillion, there are quite a few billionaires there. And like the giving pledges that many billionaires do, if they band together, then they can actually create an alternative to NIH. Just the interest income from $1 trillion will fund a lot of science.
And you already are seeing some interest from those people, both in the US and elsewhere. One of the things that I learned recently is that there are many, many more billionaires than there are supercentenarians in the world now, which strikes me as interesting. Let's put it that way.
So there are more billionaires than
110-year-olds.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there any billionaire that is 110-year-old?
I don't think, maybe. Yeah, people have been saying, because they're now backing all this research, that the mice of the new aging biology are billionaires because they're going to be taking everything.
Yeah, so we discussed about drugs and lifestyle, and then blood transfusion. Anything from stem cell biology?
Well, I think ultimately there'll be some things from stem cell biology. I think it's just lagging behind the others. The partial reprogramming stuff, I think, has a great deal of interest. The thing about it is if you don't do it right, it turns out very badly. So I think we're going to have to work out all the safety aspects of it before it moves into people. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of promise in the stem cell biology.
And what about organ transplant? Because, most people, as we get older, many people we are going to transplant our lens.
Right.
Some people will transplant various different parts. And can we do reprogramming of the organs and then transplant them back so that we'll get a younger heart?
Possibility. Might be easier to. It kind of reminds me of Genghis Khan's axe. I saw a street show where some guy's juggling axes, and he says, one of these axes, this one right here, used to belong to Genghis Khan. He goes, of course, we had to change the handle, and then we had to change the head. And I'm thinking, so at what point are you not the same person?
I think the brain.
Anymore. Is there, and what about the brain? That's the key thing, right? What about the brain? What are we going to do about the brain? People are willing to try everything, but I think just constantly replacing parts is not the kind of solution that we should be going after. I'd like better repair. Okay, we're going to give you this stem cell replacement treatment for your heart and repair all that damage that you had from the heart attack. That strikes me as feasible in the very distant future. Mm-hmm. But I think there are things on the nearer horizon, like changes in diet combined with lifestyle factors combined with potentially transfusions. We'll see how that translates, because so far it hasn't. But the animal work looks very promising, and this is a technology that we've been doing for a very long time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I tell my students, here's a business opportunity. Do you know what people are paying for plasma for people that are 20 years old? When I was in graduate school, I gave plasma to try to make money, and I think I got $50 for sitting there for 2 hours with that needle in your arm.
No, actually, I recently, a friend of mine whose father was seriously ill, was in ICU, and his hemoglobin counts went down, so that's why he had to receive a transfusion. And it was amazing. Like in 2 days, he just got out of his bed and literally walked out of the ICU. And nobody knows, even the ICU physician, he also said we had no idea what happened. Maybe he responded to treatment, he responded to something else, but after this transfusion, he just walked out. It's an N of 1 and beta.
And we don't know the age of the donor.
We don't
know.
We don't know the age of
I think it won't be long before that age is going to be part of the data that they collect from donors. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
That has been exciting, and we actually covered a lot of ground.
We did.
And actually, I get super excited about the animal stories because there is so much to learn from animal longevity that I always think that we are living in the dark ages of aging research. Because in 10 years from now, sure, we'd know way much more than what we know now.
Yeah, I agree. It's the most exciting time in this field since I've been in the field.
Thank you, Steve.
It's a pleasure. Always enjoy talking with you.
And hope to catch up again in 10 years.
Okay. When we're both 10 years younger.
Yes. Thank you.
All right.